Solomon's temple was the most expensive and imposing construction in the history of Israel, erected in absolute silence, without the noise of hammers at the construction site. But the glory of all that gold concealed a fragility that few perceived. The system functioned like clockwork, with rules so rigid that the high priest needed to wear bells on his clothing so people would know if he was still alive inside. But the greatest mystery of all is not in what was built, but in what disappeared. Why, in the records of war, does the Ark of the Covenant simply vanish without a trace? Today, you'll discover the inner workings, the daily dangers of the priests, and the truth about the final fate of humanity's greatest treasure. Most people imagine Solomon's temple as a modern cathedral, a place of absolute silence and clean marble. But the historical reality was quite different. Mount Moriah, in the year 960 before Christ, functioned much more like heavy industry than a calm sanctuary. The air didn't smell of gentle incense. It smelled of iron, blood, and smoke from burning fat. The predominant sound wasn't choirs, but the constant noise of thousands of oxen and sheep. The outer courtyard was always crowded. Israelites from all parts of the country climbed the mount, bringing animals. And this created an immediate sanitation problem. With so many daily slaughters under the strong sun of the Middle East, the stone floor should have been an uncontrollable breeding ground for flies and disease. The accumulation of blood would make the place impossible to visit within hours. To solve this, the builders didn't use miracles, but advanced engineering. The biblical account and ancient traditions indicate that below the floor, where everyone walked, there existed a complex system of channels. When the Levites washed the courtyard with water, all the dirt drained through openings in the floor. This mixture traveled through underground pipes and exited outside the walls, staining the stream in the Kidron Valley red. It was a visual warning to the entire city that the temple was in operation. But blood was only half the problem. The other half was fire. In the center of the courtyard stood the bronze altar, a massive square platform. There burned a fire that consumed enormous piles of wood. The rule was clear: the fire could never go out. Keeping this fire lit 24 hours a day required military logistics. And there was an important technical detail. The law prohibited the use of defective wood. A log with a simple worm or sign of rot made the offering invalid. For this reason, there was a team of men whose only function was to inspect each piece of firewood, one by one, ensuring nothing impure entered the flames. The result of this mixture of ashes, smoke, and heavy labor fell upon the priests. They finished their shift dirty and covered in soot. The real danger began now. They needed to enter the main building, the holy place, to continue the service. But entering that place without being perfectly clean meant death. They needed a complete bath, right there in the courtyard. But there was no modern plumbing or showers. And in this video, you'll still discover the hydraulic technology that defied gravity to bring water to the top. The reason why the most important room was a cube of total darkness. And the mystery of what really happened to the Ark of the Covenant. Solomon's solution for washing hundreds of men was to create one of the largest metal structures ever seen in the ancient world. The biblical text gives this tank a curious name: the Sea of Bronze. It wasn't a common pool. It was a colossal, round reservoir with capacity for about 40,000 liters of water. The most impressive thing wasn't just the volume, but the engineering of the base. The tank didn't touch the ground. It was suspended in the air, supported by 12 oxen made of solid metal, 3 facing each cardinal direction. Making a piece this size was a logistical nightmare for the time. There was no technology in Jerusalem to cast so much bronze in a single piece without it cracking. The account in Kings tells that the craftsmen had to go down to the Jordan River Valley. There, the soil was clay and thick, the only place where they managed to dig the gigantic molds necessary to melt and shape the metal. Once ready, the piece had to be transported uphill to the mount, an effort that required hundreds of men. But having a fixed tank didn't solve the service's agility. The courtyard was enormous, and carrying buckets all day would tire the workers and delay the slaughter. The solution was to create a mobile system. Besides the giant pool, the account describes 10 bronze bases equipped with wheels and complex axles. They were heavy transport carts. The priests pushed these cleaning stations to where the meat was being cut, washed the pieces right there, and pushed them back. It functioned like an industrial assembly line on wheels, something very advanced for the period. But this entire structure depended on one thing the mount didn't have: abundant water. The temple was at the high point, and water doesn't climb hills by itself. To keep these tanks full, it was necessary to bring water from sources that were kilometers away. Engineers of the time used gravity in their favor. They likely built systems of cisterns and channels that captured rain and brought water from springs in neighboring hills. The water traveled kilometers by natural pressure until it flowed into the temple's reservoirs. With the fire lit and water guaranteed, the machine was ready to function. But the men who operated all this faced constant personal risk. They dealt with cold stone and cold water all day, which caused chronic diseases. And to make matters worse, there was a strict rule about work uniforms. If a priest entered the sanctuary with the wrong clothing or without a specific piece of protection, he not only lost his position, he put his own life at immediate risk. The water system solved external cleaning, but didn't protect the men from the real danger. The clothing worn by the high priest, for example, wasn't just a ceremonial outfit. The text of Exodus describes that the hem of the robe needed to have small golden bells interspersed with pomegranates of fabric. The function of this noise wasn't musical. It was a sign of life. The biblical account states that the sound served so that he would be heard inside, so that he would not die. Absolute silence in the sanctuary was interpreted as a sign of fatal danger. While the bells rang, those outside knew the leader was still alive and moving. For common priests, the risk was physical and daily. The law required that any service in the courtyard be done with bare feet. There was no exception. The floor was stone and marble. Historical accounts indicate that working 12 hours a day in direct contact with the cold floor and washing water caused chronic health problems. Most of these men suffered from intestinal pains and severe kidney diseases, since they wore only thin linen tunics without protection against the cold of mornings on the mount. There was also the problem of overcrowding. Over the centuries, the number of priests increased so much that there wasn't enough work for everyone. The task of cleaning the ashes from the altar early in the morning was considered a maximum honor. Tradition tells that, at first, there was no schedule. Any priest who wanted the task ran up the altar ramp. The first to reach the top earned the right to serve. But this sacred race got out of control. The competition became physical. Ancient records mention that, in the competition for position, priests pushed each other. In one specific case, a man had his leg broken during the climb. The situation became so dangerous that the temple leaders needed to intervene. The race was prohibited and replaced by a mathematical lottery system to avoid violence among the religious themselves. The dispute was fierce outside, where the sun beat down. But there was a boundary that few had the courage to cross. The door of the main building marked the limit between the human world and an unknown reality. Passing through that entrance meant leaving natural light behind and entering an environment designed to completely confuse human vision. As soon as the door closed, the priest lost reference to the outside world. The interior of the holy place didn't have visible stone walls. The account in 1 Kings is emphatic in saying that everything was covered with cedar and, over the wood, covered with pure gold. Floor, ceiling, and walls. There wasn't a single exposed centimeter of stone. This created a visual effect that modern architects would call loss of depth. Without large windows to see the horizon and with highly reflective surfaces on all sides, the notion of distance disappeared. The only source of illumination came from the menorah, the 7-branched candelabrum made of solid gold. The light from the flames hit the golden walls and ricocheted infinitely. It's likely that the architectural intention was precisely this: to create an environment where defined shadows didn't exist, making the priest feel he was no longer in a common physical place, but suspended in liquid light. Maintaining this light was critical. Ancient Jewish tradition reports a phenomenon that defied the priest's logic. They believed that the central flame, facing west, never went out by itself, even when the oil ran out. For the mentality of the time, this wasn't chemistry. It was a daily sign that the divine presence approved the service. If that light failed, fear spread throughout the entire country. On the opposite side of the light was the table of showbread. There were 12 large loaves, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. By law, they should be changed only once a week, every Sabbath. Here entered a conflict with biology. In the heat of the Middle East, bread left in the open air hardens and molds in a few days. But historical accounts suggest that, in this controlled environment, the loaves remained fresh and warm for 7 entire days, as if they had just come out of the oven. For the people, this meant that the covenant with God continued alive and fresh. The environment was designed to overload the senses. The strong smell of incense burning on the smaller altar, the intense brightness of the gold, and the heat of the flames in a closed space. But all this visual ostentation stopped abruptly before a fabric barrier. At the back of the hall, there was a thick, heavy curtain. Everything in the holy place was made to shine and reflect light. But a few meters away, behind that curtain, there existed a room where gold didn't serve to illuminate anything, because the rule inside was absolute darkness. This room had no windows, no cracks, no lamps. It was a perfect geometric cube, measuring 20 cubits in length, width, and height. In modern measurements, that would be about 10 meters in each direction. Unlike the previous hall, where gold served to reflect light, here gold served to reflect only darkness. The theology of the time was visual and direct. God stated that he would dwell in the dark cloud. The silence inside was absolute, isolated from the noise of animals and prayers happening outside. But the space wasn't empty. Most modern illustrations show the Ark of the Covenant alone in the center, looking small. The account in 1 Kings, however, describes something much more intimidating. Solomon ordered the construction of 2 gigantic cherubim statues made of olive wood and covered with gold. They weren't small decorative figures. Each was 5 meters tall. The size of these structures created an intentional sense of claustrophobia. The cherubim's wings were so large that, when spread, they reached the side walls of the room and touched in the center. The biblical text says they occupied the entire width of the sanctuary. Whoever entered there didn't see an ample space, but found themselves squeezed beneath these massive figures looking down, guarding the central object. The Ark of the Covenant didn't simply sit on the floor. Jewish tradition affirms that it rested on a protruding rock. the foundation stone, considered the physical connection point between heaven and earth. If you believe that God's presence is what makes a place sacred, leave a comment now saying, "God is in control." This helps us know who's following this journey of faith and history this far. The ark itself was the only furniture in the room, but its function wasn't to be a luxury throne. It functioned as a maximum security vault. The solid gold lid, called the mercy seat, couldn't be moved. And the reason for so much secrecy and protection wasn't the financial value of what was stored inside. If someone had the impossible permission to lift that lid and look at the contents, they wouldn't find jewels or treasures. They would find physical evidence of crimes committed by the people themselves. Want to receive more biblical studies? Just subscribe to the channel to follow along. There's a video every day. Inside the golden box, there were 3 specific objects: the tablets of the law, a jar with manna, and Aaron's rod. Popular view treats these items as sacred trophies, but an analysis of historical context shows they served as a record of failures. The tablets were the copy of the law that the people broke by worshipping a golden calf. The manna was kept because they complained about the food they received in the desert, and the rod was there because they questioned leadership and attempted a coup. The ark functioned as a permanent archive of national rebellion. The only barrier between these objects and divine judgment was the ark's lid, called the mercy seat. Made of solid gold, it had an essential mechanical function in the ritual. Once a year, the high priest entered there and sprinkled animal blood on this lid. The theological logic was precise. The blood covered the lid, preventing the items of rebellion from being seen from above. Judgment stopped at the blood and didn't reach the broken law inside the box. But there was a physical detail in the ark that affected those outside. The law prohibited removing the carrying poles used to transport the object. They should remain in the side rings forever, signaling that the ark could depart at any moment. The text in 1 Kings observes that these poles were so long that the ends pushed the separation curtain outward. Whoever worked in the holy place couldn't see the ark, but saw the 2 bulges in the heavy curtain. That functioned as constant visual proof. The priests knew the presence was there, not by blind faith, but because the wood pressed the fabric physically. It was daily tension, knowing that the most dangerous object on earth was just a few meters away, separated by a fabric barrier that seemed about to rupture. The ark defined the temple's purpose for centuries. But the structure around it concealed an even greater engineering secret. To erect such thick and complex walls in a sacred location, the builders had to obey a rule of silence that seems impossible for a construction site of this size. Biblical law strictly prohibited the use of iron tools at the construction site. The theological justification was symbolic, since iron was the material used to make swords of war, and the temple should be a house of peace. But this restriction created a logistical nightmare for engineers. How to erect a building of solid stone without the noise of hammers and chisels? To obey this rule, Solomon's builders set up an unprecedented prefabrication operation for the time. The gigantic stones were cut, measured, and trimmed at the quarries, kilometers away from the mount. When the blocks arrived at the construction site, they needed to fit perfectly into each other, without the need for final adjustments. It was a puzzle of thousands of tons where an error of a millimeter meant discarding the entire piece, since hitting the stone to correct the flaw would violate the sanctity of the place. But a technical doubt arises that intrigues researchers to this day. If the use of iron was restricted, how did they cut such hard rocks with precision? Here, history enters the terrain of Jewish oral tradition. The Talmud mentions the shamir, described in some texts as a worm, and in others as a substance capable of cutting stone just by touch. Although modern archaeology suggests the use of abrasive sand and copper saws or diamond tips, the legend of the shamir reflects the mystery of a technology that allowed building in absolute silence. The silence at the work contrasted with the noise of international negotiation necessary to complete the finishing. Israel didn't possess adequate forests for the roof and internal covering. Solomon needed to make an aggressive trade agreement with Hiram, king of Tyre, in present-day Lebanon. In exchange for noble cedar and juniper wood, Israel sent tons of wheat and refined oil annually. The cost of this import was so high that the national treasury couldn't cover it. The account in 1 Kings informs that, to settle the final debt, Solomon had to hand over 20 cities of Galilee to the king of Tyre. The temple was glorious on the outside, but its economic foundation was compromised. It was erected on an unpayable foreign debt and a system of heavy taxes that generated popular dissatisfaction. This internal fragility would exact its price very quickly. Only 5 years after the builder's death, the gates that seemed impregnable would be opened, not by faith, but by total surrender to a foreign army. The temple's functioning depended on an invisible structure for those who only looked at the sacrifices: textile production. The building was separated by monumental curtains, and the high priest himself wore complex layers of linen and wool. The biblical account and historical traditions indicate that there existed an exclusive guild of women dedicated to weaving these pieces. They operated gigantic looms to produce the veil that separated the most holy place. A piece that, according to later historical records, had the thickness of a palm's width and required the strength of dozens of men just to be transported. While men occupied the altar, women dominated the court of women, a large area that served as the true social heart of Jerusalem. They didn't cross the barrier to the inner courtyard of priests, but it was there, in that space, that community life happened. They brought offerings of gratitude after childbirth and participated in the great festivals of illumination. The logistics of keeping the temple clean and stocked with bread and new fabrics depended directly on this manual women's work, which transformed raw materials into objects of sacred worship. But this logistical and religious harmony began to crumble because of disastrous political decisions. To maintain alliances with neighboring kingdoms, the kings of Israel allowed foreign customs to invade these same courtyards. What was once a place of exclusive devotion came to house altars for gods of war and fertility. The influence of these external cultures didn't just change religion, but corrupted the temple's administration, transforming the sacred place into a warehouse of stone idols. This internal degradation left the temple vulnerable. The protection the city felt for having God's house within its walls became a dangerous illusion. The Egyptian army, perceiving this moral and military weakness, marched against Jerusalem. They didn't want to convert the people, but take away the only thing that still shone intensely in the profaned courtyards. The invading army ignored the rituals and focused on the treasury chambers, initiating a plunder that would change the temple's face forever. The Babylonian siege lasted about a year and a half. When Nebuchadnezzar's soldiers finally broke through the walls in 586 before Christ, they didn't find organized military resistance, but a population decimated by hunger. The Book of Lamentations describes a scenario of absolute social collapse, where lack of food led inhabitants to eat boiled leather and even commit cannibalism. The temple, which the population believed to be an indestructible shield against invaders, transformed into the final stage of massacre. The order of the Babylonian guard commander, Nebuzaradan, wasn't to occupy the building, but to erase it from existence. They set fire to the entire complex. The cedar wood from Lebanon, dry and aged for centuries, served as ideal fuel for an industrial-scale fire. The heat generated was so intense that the limestone structure didn't just burn, but cracked and collapsed. Here occurs a physical phenomenon that explains the current state of the mount. Since the sanctuary's interior was covered with gold, the fire melted the precious metal. The liquid gold flowed into the cracks of the floor and between the large foundation stone blocks. To recover this wealth, the Babylonian soldiers couldn't just loot what was visible. They needed to leverage, break, and turn over every stone, dismantling the temple down to ground level to scrape gold from the cracks. This left the place unrecognizable. But there's an intriguing omission in the war reports of the time. The Book of Jeremiah and the Second Book of Kings provide a bureaucratic and detailed list of everything that was taken to Babylon. The inventory cites the bronze basins, the shovels for collecting ashes, the meat forks, and even the exact weight of the metal from the entrance columns. However, the most valuable and famous item doesn't appear on the spoils list. The Ark of the Covenant isn't mentioned as captured, wasn't displayed in victory parades in Babylon, and doesn't appear on the return list years later. The central object of Israel's history disappeared from records without leaving a physical trace. The invaders believed that, by tearing down the walls and taking survivors chained into exile, they had killed Israel's faith. They destroyed God's physical address on earth. But this demolition forced the exiles to discover a new theological reality. Their religion could survive without a building. 5 centuries after the Babylonian destruction, the scene on Mount Moriah was visually more impressive than in Solomon's time. Herod the Great initiated a colossal renovation in the year 20 before Christ that transformed the complex into the largest religious platform in the Roman world. The stones used in the foundation were so heavy that even today engineers debate how they were moved without hydraulic technology. External luxury returned, marble shone, and gold covered the facade again. But those who knew history knew there was a fundamental problem at the heart of the new building. The Holy of Holies, that perfect cube that once housed the divine presence, was empty. There was no Ark of the Covenant, no giant cherubim, and, according to Jewish tradition accounts, the cloud of glory never descended to fill the house as before. When the high priest entered there on the Day of Atonement, he didn't sprinkle blood on the golden mercy seat, but directly on the bare stone of the floor, called the foundation stone. It was a magnificent temple on the outside, but hollow inside. The spiritual tension changed radically in the year 33 of our era. The Gospel account describes that, at the moment of Jesus' death, the thick curtain that separated the holy place from the rest of the world tore from top to bottom. For the Christian theology being born there, this signaled the end of the danger zone described in chapter 3. God's presence would no longer be restricted to a dark stone box, but would come to dwell in people. The physical temple lost its exclusive function of intermediation. Shortly after, in the year 70, the Roman legions of General Titus repeated Babylon's feat and completely destroyed the Second Temple. Today, in the place where Solomon and Herod built their sanctuaries, stand the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the story hasn't ended. In Jerusalem, there exists an organization called the Temple Institute that has already prepared architectural plans, sewn priestly garments following ancient instructions, and even built a pure gold menorah ready for use. For them, reconstruction isn't a distant legend. It's an engineering plan awaiting only a political change to begin. The question that defines the current geopolitics of the Middle East is no longer how the temple functioned in the past, but what will happen to the world if someone tries to build the third. Click now on the video on the screen to discover what life was like in cities during Jesus' time, how they lived and survived the dangers of the era, Click now on the video on the screen.